So I'm Marc Cohn. I think I met most of you because now we're in the winding down, but I do have I did actually add a slide about my new affiliation. As of this week, actually, I joined ClearPath Networks, which is a company based in Southern California in the U.S. that's actually focused on enabling virtualized services. And we've actually been deployed in some of the large operators and actually have been really focusing on SDN and NFV. And this is a very new development, which is why I wanted to include this. But today's talk is about CarrierGrade SDN. And when we define this in the Open Networking Foundation, we look at it in terms of the three customer segments that we actually serve. The first one being the data center, which is really what kicked off a lot of the activities in the Open Networking Foundation. A lot of the work that was at Stanford University and the ClearPath, or Clean Slate rather, project that was actually started, I think, in the mid-2000 time frame, resulted in an interest in a programmable network and a common way of actually programming switches and routers to enable research. And the data center guided a lot of the early activities in the Open Networking Foundation, the 2011, 2012, and even up to 2013 timeframe. And then around 2013, with the introduction of network functions virtualization, as well as a great deal of interest, actually for transport, for the optical industry, there was a shift in terms of at least some of the focus and attention on telecommunication operators. There's no question that in the beginning that operators were one of the constituents that we wanted to serve, but we thought that the time frame might take a little longer than what it proved to be, and we've been very pleasantly surprised. And so we also serve the enterprise and campus segment, and it turns out that that segment is really not yet materialized in terms of the interest in the open SDN architecture. So now what I want to do is just talk a little bit about CarrierGrade SDN, what it is, what it means to the Open Networking Foundation, and then of course what we're actually doing in this area, because we do have a number of major projects that are going on, and we have over the last couple of years. The first one is that we are seeing some trends that are really guiding operators, and we've heard this throughout the week, we've heard this throughout the last 2 years. They're the trends that are really driving the need for a more dynamic and programmable network infrastructure. One is certainly the change in end user behavior that are being that's really been guided by the mobility industry. That's really shifted all of our thinking around being able to access our data and access the network, access connectivity anytime, anywhere, on any device. And that's had its dramatic implications on the overall network infrastructure. Next, operators have really been affected by the cloud and in many different ways. One of those ways is the competitive landscape for major telecommunication operators has changed quite dramatically. And it's not just the over-the-top providers, but there's alternative providers and cloud providers and a whole range of service providers that are actually seeking to redefine how telecommunication services or connectivity services can be used and leveraged to be able to offer a higher layer service. And this is at a time when the demands on these networks are dramatically increasing, primarily because of mobile video, but the revenue per user continues to be relatively flat. The fact that we're moving from 10 gigabits to 100 gigabits in transport doesn't necessarily mean we can charge an order of magnitude in our mobile phone bills. And if we tried to do that, I think we'd all have to try to figure out a different technology to use, because it's not going to happen. And then, of course, the other aspect, another trend that we're seeing is that the OEMs, the manufacturers of equipment, the hardware providers, and even software providers, they're being completely transformed by openness. Openness defined as a way to enable operators to deploy multi-vendor infrastructure, but to do it in a way that allows for the is not necessarily controlled by a single vendor. That's how we define openness within the Open Networking Foundation. If you heard Dan Pitt's keynote a couple of days ago, he talked about this. We talked about this in our workshop on Tuesday, and it's a very significant departure from the thought that multi-vendor is sufficient, because it really is not. And as a result of this, we've seen the emergence of open source. And Bill gave the keynote earlier about what we're doing with ONOS, and then of course Rob talked about Open Daylight earlier, and then we've heard about OpenStack and many other open source initiatives. And these are actually some of the factors that are leading operators to SDN and are motivating the Open Networking Foundation to respond to those needs. And if you don't believe it, here's some market research from Infinetics, who has surveyed the global operators, large operators that represent over half the global CapEx spend. So collectively, these operators are responsible for tens of billions of dollars of investment. And that survey revealed that 97% of the operators surveyed plan to deploy software-defined networking, and 93% plan to deploy network function virtualization. And many of those plan to deploy both, because SDN is an enabler for network function virtualization, and we can certainly debate to what extent that actually exists depending on the operator we're talking about. So there's no question there's a great interest, there's trends that are driving it, and it's really starting to happen. If we look at the community, the Open Networking Foundation community of companies that are, and these are just the operators that are interested and participating and join the Open Networking Foundation, we see that it's a global phenomenon. APAC has certainly been very exciting, the type of growth that we've experienced. But if we look at EMEA, we look at North America, they're very familiar names. These are leading operators, not just the smaller ones, even though they're all smaller companies as well. And then if I actually wanted to take more time, I could fill the page with the OEMs and the other software companies and hardware companies that are also participating in telecommunications from their perspective in the value chain. So in the net of it is that there are many operators who are really driving this transition and migration to CarrierGrade SDN. So the Open Networking Foundation responded. This is just a simplified organizational structure of the ONF that indicates that the 4 different areas, the operator area that is responsible for sort of creating use cases, prioritizing requirements, guiding the activities of the entire ONF. The services area that Andy Malice from Huawei, who's hiding over in the corner on the extreme. I don't know why you're out in the tributary, Andy, but he actually leads that area. That's the architecture activities, the big picture activities in the ONF. The specifications area is where we define the actual protocols and standards and specifications that we're actually producing for the implementers of this technology. And there's 2 working groups, in particular, the optical transport group and the mobile wireless group, that have been very, very active throughout the last couple of years. And then finally, there's the market area that I'm responsible for. We're responsible more for communicating this, doing events like this, the publications, and so forth. And of course, we've actually done a lot of work within the market area of communicating to the overall community about the benefits of open software-defined network for the carriers. And you can go to the Open Networking Foundation website and take a look at some of these publications, because they're very specific for things like NFV or optical transport. We have one underway for the implications on OSS, BSS, many topics that are specific to the telecommunications and the carrier community. So one of the questions that I get a lot is, so how does the ONF fit in when there's such a broad community? And this is the 3-layer architecture model that I think I've seen about 10 times in the last couple of days, which I don't intend to go over. But what I wanted to do is to map some of the activities in with regard to the other groups that are participating. The first ones are the industry groups. And these are the groups that actually are consisting of end users, primarily, End users guide all of the ONF activities, but these are other end user groups like the ETSI NFV Industry Specification Group, the group that actually created network function virtualization, or at least the architecture for it. Even in the enterprise, the Open Networking Users Group is a group of large financial services companies that established a forum so they can talk about open networking in the context of large enterprise, which is really shifting its focus from being infrastructure oriented to even delivering what they refer to as IT as a service. So in other words, they're shifting their thoughts to becoming mini service providers, and in some cases not so many. The next are the standards bodies, and the Open Networking Foundation has been liaising and engaging with standards bodies since the beginning. TM Forum is working with us on the information modeling effort for the northbound, or the application to controller interface. And then, of course, there's been the MEF, which is next door, and has been working on the LSO, or the Lifecycle Services Orchestrator, or orchestration, which is one of their major initiatives that fits on top of this architecture model. And you heard a presentation from the OIF earlier in this room about what we've been doing on the prototype demo and how we've been engaging on extending OpenFlow and extending ONF standards to support DWDM, layer 0, OTN at layer 1, and the overall environment for transport SDN. And then finally, the other missing key piece, which is the open source projects. Actually, I shouldn't say missing, because they are very vital and central to what we've been doing in the Open Networking Foundation, but also what operators are thinking about in terms of deploying SDN long term. There will be many different types of controllers from vendors, but there will be a much fewer SDN controller frameworks that are going to emerge in these controllers because of the efforts of the open source community. And I show a couple of the significant ones here. Bill was talking about ONOS earlier. We talked about Open Daylight earlier. There's RIU in NTT's offering in the open source community, and others, even though there's a lot of discussion about how many do we need, and the market's going to determine that we don't need too many of them. I don't know what the right number is, but it's probably not going to be just one. And then, of course, there's another open source project called the Open Platform for NFV, or the OPNFV, which we referred to earlier. And the OPNFV is really a project to create an open reference platform so that we can not only allow for the validation of an implementation, but also to validate the architecture and the requirements. OPNFV is going to have a key role because it involves operators up front to help guide how the pieces are put together. OPNFV is going to adopt some of these other open source components, like the ones shown here, or OpenStack, Open Daylight. I think ONOS is going to ultimately be there. KVM is the hypervisor, as well as DPDK at the forwarding level, and there's actually other projects as well that are going to be on the Open Platform for NFV agenda. So the idea is to be able to just create a relationship so that these projects and these bodies are not competing, they're not conflicting, but they're very complementary. And just a couple of weeks ago, I published an article, or Light Reading published an article on that actually indicates a little more detail about how this fits together that you can take a look at. I'll provide the link in the slides that I'm going to be sharing with the conference. But suffice it to say that we need all of these bodies working together, because SDN is just too great, and especially with the problems that we're trying to address for the carrier environment. We talked about in the OAF presentation, we showed a similar slide to this. One of the major developments from last year was the prototype demo that we did in conjunction with the OIF, or the Optical Internetworking Forum. 7 carriers, 9 vendors, a global network connectivity, over 100 gig network. Not to mention, we actually looked not only at OpenFlow being the controller to the hardware interface, but we also looked at the northbound with this project as well. And since there was a presenter that actually talked about this in more detail, I don't intend to spend a lot more time on this activity. But if you look at the names at the bottom, these are the major both operators, or really the names at the top rather, major operators in the world. They're global, they're covering all the regions. And if you look at the bottom, they're the major OEMs who participated in this as well. So anyhow, I wanted to allow a little time for questions. So again, the last thing I just wanted to say about Carrier SDN is that the ONF is very committed to Carrier SDN, and it continues to invest dramatically in ensuring that we not only are providing an architecture and specifications that are appropriate for carriers, but that we're engaging in the community. This is really key, especially in the telecommunications sector, which is very, very broad-based. And we have many problems to solve, some of which we don't have to solve in the data center, as an example. There's different problems there, dealing with soft switches and dealing with scale and horizontal availability and some of the other things that we don't necessarily have to deal with in the carrier world. So with that, I wanted to, I think I have a few more minutes, if I may. Are there any questions? Okay, well in that case.
I do have one question.
We have some time. Go ahead.
Yeah. So you showed all the different open source and standards.
Well, I didn't show all of them. I showed some of the groups.
Yeah, which are
What's
applicable.
on this slide, just to clarify, if I may, just for a minute. These are groups that I picked, not just arbitrarily. These are all groups that the Open Networking Foundation is liaising with and working with. That's why they're on this slide. There's many more groups, like you can think of standards bodies for different industries and the like. But I just picked some of the groups that were particularly relevant to the carrier world.
Yeah, so I just wanted to know, do you have an example use case that you're working across these standards bodies to show, or POC or something
Here's
like that?
Here's a good use case. The transport SDN is one of the better use cases, because we're working with TMF on the northbound and a joint information modeling effort. We're working with, in this case it was Open Daylight, but we expect to be extending that to work with ONOS as well, to work to create the controller. We're working with the OpenFlow protocol that got extended to support the optical world, which is layer 0, DWDM and OTN. And not only that, OIF is participating at that level. And now we're working with the Metro Ethernet former, excuse me, where's Kevin? No, MEF, which is what we call it now, to provide the orchestration. Now, that's not part of this particular effort, but that's an example. Transport SDN is the best example I can think of as a use case. And if you look at some of the other market research, actually, but with another company, but Michael Howard from Infinetics, who's reasonably well known in the industry and wanted to be here, but he couldn't. He also had a chart, and he asked the operators, what use cases are you interested in for SDN? And number 1 on the list was optical transport. And it's not hard to figure out why, with the kind of scale and capacity that operators are trying to drive at a reasonable cost.
Okay, thank you.